Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Welcome back. We are waiting for Theresa May to take to the lectern in Florence for this Brexit speech that she's giving. In the last few seconds, the Telegraph newspaper are reporting that she is going to raise the prospect of leaving the EU before 2019 in this speech. John Rentoul, who's in our Westminster studio. What do you make of that, John? Where has it come from and why?
I'm not quite sure. I mean, it's presumably come from someone seeing an early draft of the speech. But, I mean, the point is that it's only possible for us to leave before the 29th of March 2019 if there's an agreement. Because the way the Article 50 process works is it sets a 2-year timetable. There's a 2-year clock ticking. If there isn't agreement by the end of that 2-year period, which is the 29th of March 2019, then we leave anyway without a deal. So the only way you can cut that process short would be to secure a deal early. And I don't see that that's very likely, given the complexity of the whole process.
Or no deal? Yeah. It's either you do a deal early or
but no deal can only happen on the 29th of March 2019, because no deal only happens when the clock actually runs out and you've failed to actually agree something. So it's not a threat. I don't understand what it is. It may be just suggesting that if we can agree the transition deal quickly, we can get on with it, start the transition period, and get on with the negotiations about the trade relationship after the transition period.
Imke, you seem to think that you could declare a no deal.
I'm not entirely sure, I have to admit, but I think you could just, if you say no, we're not going to reach a deal, you could leave at any point. I think the 2 years it can't be longer than that. But if you just say, OK, we are not going to have a deal.
And that is exactly, Nabil, that's exactly what Brexiteers on the harder, quote-unquote, side would want, isn't it? They want the possibility of walking away, saying, we're done with this, we're out, we'll go.
Well, absolutely, and if this rumour turns out to be true, I think it makes a great deal of sense that the whole point of Brexit is not to rely on technocrats sitting in Brussels and doing quite well out of it. And if Britain goes down that route, then it has a great honesty, in approaching things like that. I think, what May will be trying to do is to appeal to nation states directly, but also to business communities. And there will, of course, be a great deal of symbolism in May's speech taking place in Florence, of course, which is the Renaissance trade capital. It's made its name and reputation on exporting capitalism, and that's precisely what Britain wants to do again, not just with EU nation state, but also redefining its position in the world and perhaps, retain or revigorate its status almost as an imperial nation, flying the Union Jack again all over the world.
Actually, if you really would try to address the nations above and over the head of the EU, that would betray a abysmal misunderstanding of how it works.
I'm going to have to stop you there, Imke. Prime Minister taking to the stage.
It's good to be here in this great city of Florence today, at a critical time in the evolution of the relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union. It was here, more than anywhere else, that the Renaissance began, a period of history that inspired centuries of creativity and critical thought across our continent, and which in many ways defined what it meant to be European. A period of history whose example shaped the modern world. A period of history that teaches us that when we come together in a spirit of ambition and innovation, we have it within ourselves to do great things. That shows us, if we open our minds to new thinking and new possibilities, we can forge a better, brighter future for all our peoples. And that is what I want to focus on today. For we are moving through a new and critical period in the history of the United Kingdom's relationship with the European Union. The British people have decided to leave the EU, and to be a global, free-trading nation able to chart our own way in the world. For many, this is an exciting time, full of promise. For others, it is a worrying one. I look ahead with optimism, believing that if we use this moment to change not just our relationship with Europe, but also the way we do things at home, this will be a defining moment in the history of our nation. And it is an exciting time for many in Europe too. The European Union is beginning a new chapter. Just last week, President Juncker set out his ambitions for the future of the European Union. There is a vibrant debate going on about the shape of the EU's institutions and the direction of the Union in the years ahead. We don't want to stand in the way of that. Indeed, we want to be your strongest friend and partner as the EU and the UK thrive side by side. And that partnership is important. For as we look ahead, we see shared challenges and opportunities in common. Here in Italy today, our two countries are working together to tackle some of the greatest challenges of our time. Challenges where all too often geography has put Italy on the front line. As I speak, Britain's Royal Navy, National Crime Agency and Border Force are working alongside their Italian partners to save lives in the Mediterranean and crack down on the evil traffickers who are exploiting desperate men, women and children who seek a better life. Our two countries are also working together in the fight against terrorism, from our positions at the forefront of the international coalition against Daesh to our work to disrupt the networks terrorist groups use to finance their operations and recruit to their ranks. And earlier this week, I was delighted that Prime Minister Gentiloni was able to join President Macron and myself in convening the first ever UN summit of government and industry to move further and faster in preventing terrorist use of the internet. Mass migration and terrorism are but two examples of the challenges to our shared European interests and values that we can only solve in partnership. The weakening growth of global trade, the loss of popular support for the forces of liberalism and free trade that is driving moves towards protectionism, the threat of climate change, depleting and degrading the planet we leave for future generations, and most recently, the outrageous proliferation of nuclear weapons by North Korea with a threat to use them. Here on our own continent, we see territorial aggression to the east, and from the south, threats from instability and civil war, terrorism, crime, and other challenges which respect no borders. The only way for us to respond to this vast array of challenges is for like-minded nations and peoples to come together and defend the international order that we have worked so hard to create, and the values of liberty, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law by which we stand. Britain has always and will always stand with its friends and allies in defence of these values. Our decision to leave the European Union is in no way a repudiation of this long-standing commitment. We may be leaving the European Union, but we are not leaving Europe. Our resolve to draw on the full weight of our military, intelligence, diplomatic and development resources to lead international action with our partners on the issues that affect the security and prosperity of our peoples is unchanged. Our commitment to the defence and indeed the advance of our shared values is undimmed. Our determination to defend the stability, security and prosperity of our European neighbours and friends remains steadfast. And we will do all this as a sovereign nation in which the British people are in control. Their decision to leave the institution of the European Union was an expression of that desire, a statement about how they want their democracy to work. They want more direct control of decisions that affect their daily lives. And that means those decisions being made in Britain by people directly accountable to them. The strength of feeling that the British people have about this need for control and the direct accountability of their politicians is one reason why, throughout its membership, the United Kingdom has never totally felt at home being in the European Union. And perhaps because of our history and geography, the European Union never felt to us like an integral part of our national story in the way it does to so many elsewhere in Europe. It is a matter of choices. The profound pooling of sovereignty that is a crucial feature of the European Union permits unprecedentedly deep cooperation, which brings benefits. But it also means that when countries are in the minority, they must sometimes accept decisions they do not want, even affecting domestic matters with no market implications beyond their borders. And when such decisions are taken, they can be very hard to change. So the British electorate made a choice. They chose the power of domestic democratic control over pooling that control, strengthening the role of the UK Parliament and the devolved Scottish Parliament, Welsh and Northern Ireland assemblies in deciding our laws. That is our choice. It does not mean that we are no longer a proud member of the family of European nations, and it does not mean we are turning our back on Europe, or worse, that we do not wish the EU to succeed. The success of the EU is profoundly in our national interest and that of the wider world. But having made this choice, the question now is whether we, the leaders of Britain and of the EU's member states and institutions, can demonstrate that creativity, that innovation, that ambition that we need to shape a new partnership to the benefit of all our people. I believe we must, and I believe we can. For while the UK's departure from the EU is inevitably a difficult process, it is in all of our interests for our negotiations to succeed. If we were to fail or be divided, the only beneficiaries would be those who reject our values and oppose our interests. So I believe that we share a profound sense of responsibility to make this change work smoothly and sensibly, not just for people today, but for the next generation who will inherit the world we leave them. The eyes of the world are on us. But if we can be imaginative and creative about the way we establish this new relationship, if we can proceed on the basis of trust in each other, I believe we can be optimistic about the future we can build for the United Kingdom and for the European Union. In my speech at Lancaster House earlier this year, I set out the UK's negotiating objectives. Those still stand today. Since that speech and the triggering of Article 50 in March, the UK has published 14 papers to address the current issues in the talks and set out the building blocks of the relationship we would like to see with the EU, both as we leave and into the future. We've now conducted 3 rounds of negotiations, and while at times those negotiations have been tough, it's clear that thanks to the professionalism and diligence of David Davis and Michel Barnier, we have made concrete progress on many important issues. For example, we have recognised from the outset there are unique issues to consider when it comes to Northern Ireland. The UK government, the Irish government and the EU as a whole have been clear that through the process of our withdrawal, we will protect progress made in Northern Ireland over recent years and the lives and livelihoods that depend on this progress. As part of this, we and the EU have committed to protecting the Belfast Agreement and the Common Travel Area. And looking ahead, we have both stated explicitly that we will not accept any physical infrastructure at the border. We owe it to the people of Northern Ireland, and indeed to everyone on the island of Ireland, to see through these commitments. We have also made significant progress on how we look after European nationals living in the UK and British nationals living in the 27 member states of the EU. I know that this whole process has been a cause of great worry and anxiety for them and their loved ones. But I want to repeat to the 600,000 Italians in the UK, and indeed to all EU citizens who have made their lives in our country, that we want you to stay, we value you, and we thank you for your contribution to our national life. And it has been and remains one of my first goals in this negotiation, to ensure that you can carry on living your lives as before. I'm clear that the guarantee I am giving on your rights is real, and I doubt anyone with real experience of the UK would doubt the independence of our courts or of the rigour with which they will uphold people's legal rights. But I know there are concerns that over time the rights of EU citizens in the UK and UK citizens overseas will diverge. And I want to incorporate our agreement fully into UK law and make sure the UK courts can refer directly to it. And when there is uncertainty around underlying EU law, I want the UK courts to be able to take into account the judgments of the European Court of Justice with a view to ensuring consistent interpretation. And on this basis, I hope our teams can reach firm agreement quickly. Now, at the moment, the negotiations are focused on the arrangements for the UK's withdrawal from the EU, but we need to move on to talk about our future relationship. Of course, we recognise that we can't leave the EU and have everything stay the same. Life for us will be different. But what we do want, and what we hope that you, our European friends, want too, is to stay as partners who carry on working together for our mutual benefit. In short, we want to work hand in hand with the European Union rather than as part of the European Union. That is why in my speech at Lancaster House, I said that the United Kingdom would seek to secure a new, deep and special partnership with the European Union. And this should span both a new economic relationship and a new relationship on security. So let me set out what each of these relationships could look like before turning to the question of how we get there. Let me start with the economic partnership. The United Kingdom is leaving the European Union. We will no longer be members of its single market or its customs union, for we understand that the single market's four freedoms are indivisible for our European friends. We recognise that the single market is built on a balance of rights and obligations, and we do not pretend that you can have all the benefits of membership of the single market without its obligations. So our task is to find a new framework that allows for a close economic partnership, but holds those rights and obligations in a new and different balance. But as we work out together how to do so, we don't start with a blank sheet of paper, like other external partners negotiating a free trade deal from scratch have done. In fact, we start from an unprecedented position, for we have the same rules and regulations as the EU, and our EU withdrawal bill will ensure they are carried over into our domestic law at the moment we leave the EU. So the question for us now, in building a new economic partnership, is not how we bring our rules and regulations closer together, but what we do when one of us wants to make changes. Now, one way of approaching this question is to put forward a stark and unimaginative choice between two models, either something based on European Economic Area membership or a traditional free trade agreement, such as that the EU has recently negotiated with Canada. I don't believe either of these options would be best for the UK or best for the European Union. European Economic Area membership would mean the UK having to adopt at home, automatically and in their entirety, new EU rules, rules over which in future we will have little influence and no vote. Such a loss of democratic control could not work for the British people. I fear it would inevitably lead to friction and then a damaging reopening of the nature of our relationship in the near future, the very last thing that anyone on either side of the Channel wants. As for a Canadian-style free trade agreement, we should recognise that this is the most advanced free trade agreement the EU has yet concluded and a breakthrough in trade between Canada and the EU. But compared with what exists between Britain and the EU today, it would nevertheless represent such a restriction on our mutual market access that it would benefit neither of our economies. Not only that, it would start from the false premise that there is no pre-existing regulatory relationship between us, and precedent suggests that it could take years to negotiate. We can do so much better than this. As I said at Lancaster House, let us not seek merely to adopt a model already enjoyed by other countries. Instead, let us be creative as well as practical in designing an ambitious economic partnership which respects the freedoms and principles of the EU and the wishes of the British people. And I believe there are good reasons for this level of optimism and ambition. First of all, the UK is the EU's largest trading partner, one of the largest economies in the world, and a market of considerable importance for many businesses and jobs across the continent. And the EU is our largest trading partner, so it is in all our interests to find a creative solution. And the EU has shown in the past that creative arrangements can be agreed in other areas. For example, it's developed a diverse array of arrangements with neighbouring countries outside the EU, both in economic relations and in justice and home affairs. Furthermore, we share the same set of fundamental beliefs: a belief in free trade, rigorous and fair competition, strong consumer rights, and that trying to beat other countries' industries by unfairly subsidising one's own is a serious mistake. So there is no need to impose tariffs where we have none now, and I don't think anyone sensible is contemplating this. And as we've set out in a future partnership paper, when it comes to trade in goods, we will do everything we can to avoid friction at the border. But of course, the regulatory issues are crucial. We share a commitment to high regulatory standards. People in Britain do not want shoddy goods, shoddy services, a poor environment, or exploitative working practices. And I can never imagine them thinking those things to be acceptable. The government I lead is committed not only to protecting high standards, but strengthening them. So I'm optimistic about what we can achieve by finding a creative solution to a new economic relationship that can support prosperity for all our peoples. Now, in any trading relationship, both sides have to agree on a set of rules which govern how each side behaves. So we will need to discuss with our European partners new ways of managing our interdependence and our differences in the context of our shared values. There will be areas of policy and regulation which are outside the scope of our trade and economic relations where this should be straightforward. There will be areas which do affect our economic relations where we and our European friends may have different goals, or where we share the same goals but want to achieve them through different means. And there will be areas where we want to achieve the same goals in the same ways because it makes sense for our economies. And because rights and obligations must be held in balance, the decisions we both take would have consequences for the UK's access to European markets and vice versa. To make this partnership work, because disagreements inevitably arise, we will need a strong and appropriate dispute resolution mechanism. It is, of course, vital that any agreement reached, its specific terms and the principles on which it is based, are interpreted in the same way by the European Union and the United Kingdom, and we want to discuss how we do that. This could not mean the European Court of Justice, or indeed UK courts being the arbiter of disputes about the implementation of the agreement between the UK and the EU, however. It wouldn't be right for one party's court to have jurisdiction over the other. But I am confident we can find an appropriate mechanism for resolving disputes. So this new economic partnership would be comprehensive and ambitious. It would be underpinned by high standards and a practical approach to regulation that enables us to continue to work together in bringing shared prosperity to our peoples for generations to come. Let me turn to the new security relationship that we want to see. To keep our people safe and to secure our values and interests, I believe it is essential that, although the UK is leaving the EU, the quality of our cooperation on security is maintained. We believe we should be as open-minded as possible about how we continue to work together on what can be life and death matters. our security cooperation is not just vital because our people face the same threats, but also because we share a deep historic belief in the same values, the values of peace, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Of course, there is no pre-existing model for cooperation between the EU and external partners which replicates the full scale and depth of the collaboration that currently exists between the EU and the UK on security, law enforcement, and criminal justice. But as the threats we face evolve faster than ever, I believe it is vital that we work together to design new dynamic arrangements that go beyond the existing arrangements that the EU has in this area, and draw on the legal models the EU has previously used to structure cooperation with external partners in other fields such as trade. So we are proposing a bold new strategic agreement that provides a comprehensive framework for future security, law enforcement and criminal justice cooperation, a treaty between the UK and the EU. This would complement the extensive and mature bilateral relationships that we already have with European friends to promote our common security. Our ambition would be to build a model that is underpinned by our shared principles, including high standards of data protection and human rights. It would be kept sufficiently versatile and dynamic to respond to the ever-evolving threats that we face. And it would create an ongoing dialogue in which law enforcement and criminal justice priorities can be shared and, where appropriate, tackled jointly. We are also proposing a far-reaching partnership on how we protect Europe together from the threats we face in the world today, how we work together to promote our shared values and interests abroad, whether security, spreading the rule of law, dealing with emerging threats, handling the migration crisis, or helping countries out of poverty. The United Kingdom has outstanding capabilities. We have the biggest defence budget in Europe and one of the largest development budgets in the world. We have a far-reaching diplomatic network and world-class security, intelligence and law enforcement services. So what we are offering will be unprecedented in its breadth, taking in cooperation on diplomacy, defence and security and development. And it will be unprecedented in its depth, in terms of the degree of engagement that we would aim to deliver. It is our ambition to work as closely as possible together with the EU, protecting our people, promoting our values, and ensuring the future security of our continent. The United Kingdom is unconditionally committed to maintaining Europe's security, and the UK will continue to offer aid and assistance to EU member states that are the victims of armed aggression, terrorism, and natural or man-made disasters. Taken as a whole, this bold new security partnership will not only reflect our history and the practical benefits of cooperation in tackling shared threats, but also demonstrate the UK's genuine commitment to promoting our shared values across the world and to maintaining a secure and prosperous Europe. That is the partnership I want Britain and the European Union to have in the future. None of its goals should be controversial. Everything I've said is about creating a long-term relationship through which the nations of the European Union and the United Kingdom can work together for the mutual benefit of all our people. If we adopt this vision of a deep and special partnership, the question is then how we get there, how we build a bridge from where we are now to where we want to be. The United Kingdom will cease to be a member of the European Union on the 29th of March 2019. We will no longer sit at the European Council table or in the Council of Ministers, and we will no longer have members of the European Parliament. Our relations with countries outside the EU can be developed in new ways, including through our own trade negotiations, because we will no longer be an EU country and we will no longer directly benefit from the EU's future trade negotiations. But the fact is that at that point, neither the UK nor the EU and its member states will be in a position to implement smoothly many of the detailed arrangements that will underpin this new relationship we seek. Neither is the EU legally able to conclude an agreement with the UK as an external partner, while it is itself still part of the European Union. And such an agreement on the future partnership will require the appropriate legal ratification, which would take time. It's also the case that people and businesses, both in the UK and in the EU, would benefit from a period to adjust to the new arrangements in a smooth and orderly way. As I said in my speech at Lancaster House, a period of implementation would be in our mutual interest. And that is why I am proposing that there should be such a period after the UK leaves the EU. Clearly, people, businesses and public services should only have to plan for one set of changes in the relationship between the UK and the EU. So during the implementation period, access to one another's markets should continue on current terms, and Britain should also continue to take part in existing security measures. And I know businesses in particular would welcome the certainty this would provide. The framework for this strictly time-limited period, which can be agreed under Article 50, would be the existing structure of EU rules and regulations. How long the period is should be determined simply by how long it will take to prepare and implement the new processes and new systems that will underpin that future partnership. For example, it will take time to put in place the new immigration system required to retake control of the UK's borders. So during the implementation period, people will continue to be able to come and live and work in the UK, but there will be a registration system, an essential preparation for the new regime. As of today, these considerations point to an implementation period of around 2 years. But because I don't believe that either the EU or the British people will want the UK to stay longer in the existing structures than is necessary, we could also agree to bring forward aspects of that future framework, such as new dispute resolution mechanisms, more quickly, if this can be done smoothly. It is clear that what would be most helpful to people and businesses on both sides who want this process to be smooth and orderly is for us to agree the detailed arrangements for this implementation period as early as possible, although we recognise that the EU institutions will need to adopt a formal position. And at the heart of these arrangements, there should be a clear double lock, a guarantee that there will be a period of implementation, giving businesses and people alike the certainty that they will be able to prepare for the change, and a guarantee that this implementation period will be time limited, giving everyone the certainty that this will not go on forever. These arrangements will create valuable certainty. But in this context, I'm conscious that our departure causes another type of uncertainty for the remaining member states and their taxpayers over the EU budget. Some of the claims made on this issue are exaggerated and unhelpful, and we can only resolve this as part of the settlement of all the issues I have been talking about today. Still, I do not want our partners to fear that they will need to pay more or receive less over the remainder of the current budget plan as a result of our decision to leave. The UK will honour commitments we have made during the period of our membership. And as we move forwards, we will also want to continue working together in ways that promote the long-term economic development of our continent. This includes continuing to take part in those specific policies and programmes which are greatly to the UK and the EU's joint advantage, such as those that promote science, education and culture, and those that promote our mutual security. And as I set out in my speech at Lancaster House, in doing so we would want to make an ongoing contribution to cover our fair share of the costs involved. When I gave my speech at the beginning of this year, I spoke not just about the preparations we were making for a successful negotiation, but also about our preparations for our life outside the European Union, with or without what I hope will be a successful deal. And the necessary work continues on all these fronts so that we are able to meet any eventual outcome. But as we meet here today, in this city of creativity and rebirth, let us open our minds to the possible, to a new era of cooperation and partnership between the United Kingdom and the European Union, and to a stronger, fairer, more prosperous future for us all. For that is the prize if we get this negotiation right. A sovereign United Kingdom and a confident European Union, both free to chart their own course. A new partnership of values and interests. A new alliance that can stand strongly together in the world. That is the goal towards which we must work in the months ahead as the relationship between Britain and Europe evolves. However it does so, I am clear that Britain's future is bright. Our fundamentals are strong. A legal system respected around the world, investment, an enthusiasm for innovation, an ease of doing business, some of the best universities and researchers you can find anywhere, an exceptional national talent for creativity and an indomitable spirit. It is our fundamental strengths that really determine a country's success, and that is why Britain's economy will always be strong. There are other reasons why our future should give us confidence. We will always be a champion of economic openness. We will always be a country whose pitch to the world is high standards at home. When we differ from the EU in our regulatory choices, it won't be to try and attain an unfair competitive advantage. It will be because we want rules that are right for Britain's particular situation. The best way for us both to succeed is to fulfil the potential of the partnership I have set out today. For we should be in no doubt that if our collective endeavours in these negotiations were to prove insufficient to reach an agreement, it would be a failure in the eyes of history and a damaging blow to the future of our continent. Indeed, I believe the difference between where we would all be if we fail and where we could be if we can achieve the kind of new partnership I've set out today to be so great that it is beholden on all of us involved to demonstrate the leadership and flexibility needed to ensure that we succeed. Yes, the negotiations to get there will be difficult, but if we approach them in the right way, respectful of the challenges for both sides and pragmatic about resolving them, we can find a way forward that makes the success of this for all our peoples. I recognise that this is not something that you, our European partners, wanted to do. It is a distraction from what you want to get on with. But we have to get this right, and we both want to get this done as swiftly as possible. So it is up to leaders to set the tone. And the tone I want to set is one of partnership and friendship, a tone of trust, the cornerstone of any relationship. For if we get the spirit of this negotiation right, if we get the spirit of this partnership right, then at the end of this process, we will find that we are able to resolve the issues where we disagree respectfully and quickly. And if we can do that, then when this chapter of our European history is written, it will be remembered not for the differences we faced, but for the vision we showed. Not for the challenges we endured, but for the creativity we used to overcome them. Not for a relationship that ended, but a new partnership that began. A partnership of interests, a partnership of values, a partnership of ambition for a shared future. The UK and the EU, side by side, delivering prosperity and opportunity for all our people. This is the future within our grasp. So together, let us seize it. Thank you. Thank you. There is an opportunity for some questions from the media. As we're in Italy, I will go first to, I think, is Monia Venturini from RAI Uno here? Monia.
As you said, 600,000 Italians now live and work in the UK, and you said you want them to remain. How? What is going to change for them? I guess something is going to change.
Well, we've set out that for those citizens, EU citizens currently living in the United Kingdom who've made the UK their home, including those 600,000 Italians who are in the United Kingdom. We want them to be able to stay and to have the same rights as they have at the moment. And we've negotiating this with the European Union because, of course, as the British Prime Minister, I want UK nationals living here in Italy and elsewhere in the European Union to be able to maintain their rights too. We're very close to ensuring that we have that agreement, and I've set out today what I hope is a reassurance that those Italian citizens living in the United Kingdom, as we move ahead, will know that it is our legal system that will guarantee those rights into the future. I think that's what people want to know. From my point of view, I value the contribution that Italian citizens have made in the United Kingdom. I have quite a few Italian citizens living in my own constituency and playing a very real part in our social and economic life there. And I want to ensure that those Italian citizens who are in the UK at the moment know that we want you to stay, we value your contribution, and what I'm setting forward today is a guarantee of your rights for the future. Thank you. Laura.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News. What do you say to voters at home who chose to leave, who might be rather angry to hear that the immigration rules will be roughly the same for another few years, markets will be roughly the same for another few years, the European courts will still have a role for another 5 years, potentially until 2021, 5 years after the referendum? Aren't they justified in being a bit cross about that? And also, if I may, in your view, is no deal still better than a bad deal?
Yes, on that last point, we continue to believe that. But the important thing, Laura, is what I have done today is set out an entire speech which is about what a great deal we can have for the future partnership between the UK and the European Union if we approach this with ambition and creativity. I've set out how we can do that today and achieve a deal that I believe is in the best interests not just of UK citizens but of people living across the remaining 27 states within what will be the remaining European Union. And on the issue of immigration that you have set out, people voted to leave the EU, and at the end of March 2019 we will leave the European Union. But I think people also voted to ensure that that process of leaving could be orderly and smooth so that people had confidence in their future and businesses had confidence in their future too. And that's what I've set out today, an implementation period which provides for that smooth and orderly withdrawal. There will be a difference during that period because we will be asking EU citizens who come to the UK, they will be able to do so, but we'll be asking them to register. And that's an important building block towards the full set of immigration rules that will be in when the new agreement, when the new partnership is in place and when we take full control of our borders. So that's an important stage in us taking full control of our borders. Faisal.
Prime Minister, on the implementation transition phase, you said that we'd still be under EU regulations and laws. Do you rule out being a member of the European Economic Area during that period? And indeed, on the final status deal, you outlined a kind of spectrum between Canada and Norway. It seemed to me that you were leaning a little bit closer, you weren't splitting the difference, you were leaning a little bit closer to Norway and perhaps the Chancellor than Canada and the Foreign Secretary. Is that a correct reading of the situation?
No, look, this is one of the things I would say to you, Faisal, is that I suggest that you start thinking not just about Norway and Canada, but actually about the fact that the UK is in a completely different relationship with the EU from either of those countries when they started negotiating their relationship with the EU. And that gives us an opportunity to create a partnership that is completely different from either of those. What we're talking about during the implementation period is a period of time for the practical changes that are necessary to put in place the full new partnership. And of course, you can't do those practical changes until you know what the partnership is. And the negotiations, of course, we will leave at the end of March 2019, and negotiations will be continuing potentially up quite close to that time. But let's think creatively. Let's be ambitious about what we can achieve, because, as I said, we start from an unprecedented position in terms of our current relationship with the EU. Remember, we're coming out, but that enables us to build a different sort of partnership for the future. James.
Prime Minister, your strategy since Lancaster House seems to be to lay out positions and then concede to what Europe will agree to. It's happened on the sequencing of talks, it's happening today on money, and it's happening on their requirements for a transition period. Can you point to a single concession from the EU that your negotiating strategy has won for you?
Well, I can say that during the negotiations we've got at the moment, there are a number of issues where we've set a position paper forward to the EU, and we now have agreement on a variety of the issues that we're looking at. But I challenge the picture that you have actually set out, James. What the United Kingdom has done throughout this process is actually set out our ambition, our negotiating principles, and if you look, I set them out in Lancaster House, those went into the Article 50 letter, and actually the negotiating guidelines that came back from the European Union to a very great extent mirrored the issues that we had raised with them in the first place as key issues that we needed to look at during this relationship. This is a negotiation. There will be, during that process, sides put out their positions, discuss those positions, and come to an agreement. What I'm doing today is saying that here is an opportunity for both of us, the UK and the EU, to come to agree to a new partnership, a partnership that hasn't been in place with anybody else in the past because of the reasons I've just set out to Faisal, but can be one that will really show a great future both for the EU and for the UK, for our future prosperity for people not just in the UK but in the European Union as well. Did I see Jason here? Yes, Jason.
Hi, Jason Groves from the Daily Mail. What would you say to those people who voted last year to leave and who think we should have left already? We should turn off the direct debit. We should stop free movement straight away and tell the European judges to get lost. They've got a right to feel a bit betrayed today, haven't they?
No, what the government is doing is ensuring that we deliver on what the people who voted to leave wanted, which is for us leaving the European Union. But if we're going to ensure that we do that in a way that has as little damage and disruption to our economy and to people's lives as possible, we need to do that in a smooth and orderly way. But what we're very clear about is that the implementation period will be time limited, and crucially that we will leave the European Union in March 2019. That's what the process of withdrawal allows for, and that is what is going to happen. Tom.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Tom Newton-Dunn from The Sun. On your section on security, you said right at the end there that the UK is unconditionally committed to securing Europe's security. That therefore means you will cooperate militarily, security-wise, intelligence-wise, with or without a deal. And so therefore, what do you say to people who might just accuse you of having thrown away Britain's best cards in this negotiation?
What I say is, look, the issues around security and our cooperation on criminal matters, on justice and home affairs matters, is important to all of us. We do face significant challenges, particularly in relation to the security issues, but we have seen over time, and obviously I saw this particularly when I was Home Secretary, how that cooperation with our European partners is good for us and good for them. So I think what members of the public would say to us is we want you, as the government, to ensure that we can continue a partnership, a cooperation that is helping in terms of keeping us safe in the UK, but also across the rest of Europe. I think that's what people want us to do, and that's what we will be doing. Now I'll take a couple more. George.
Thank you, George Parker at the not the Prime Minister, of the Financial Times. So wishful thinking, obviously. Prime Minister, can I ask you two specific questions? The first is, during the implementation phase you've just described, would Britain be subject to new laws and regulations passed by Brussels while we don't have a say in the making of those laws? And the second question is, you were setting out a sort of idea of us being quite close to the single market under this new arrangement you have in mind. Would Britain be prepared to pay for access to that single market, something some of your backbenchers say is unconscionable?
What as I said in the speech, during the implementation period, we would, and this is because it's in the interest of individuals and businesses to be able to actually have a period of time when they can make the adjustment to the new relationship, make the changes necessary, be it in IT systems or whatever, but actually know the basis on which they're going to be operating during that period, that it would be operating on the current rules and framework. Now, of course, the details of that would have to be part of the negotiation. What I've set out here is a principle in relation to that, and I think that's important. I think it's important in the interests. As I say, it's not just of businesses, but actually of individuals as well, so people know where they stand. As you'll know, George, the EU withdrawal bill that we're putting through Parliament at the moment actually brings the EU acquis, it brings EU law into UK law, precisely to ensure that we have that smooth and orderly process of withdrawal, and that people know at the point at which we leave, they still know the basis on which they're able to operate. Now, I'll take a final question. Representative of the Süddeutsche Zeitung here. Yes, sorry.
Katrin Karlwert, Süddeutsche Zeitung, München. Mrs. Prime Minister, what exactly do you now expect from Brussels and from Berlin after this speech?
Well, what I would hope that people in Brussels, in Berlin, and across the European Union would see is that this is the United Kingdom setting out the opportunity for us to work together to negotiate what would be a strong partnership, I've used the term deep and special partnership, that will ensure the future prosperity of countries in the EU and the United Kingdom in the future. And I hope that people will feel that, and will respond to it in a tone and a way of partnership and of friendship, because that is what the UK is offering. And I think it's important not just for the UK, but I think for the whole of the European Union. The EU, the remaining 27, will be considering what their future is as an EU, what the future structures of that should be. We want the EU to continue to be strong. It is in our national interest for the EU to continue to be successful. What I've set out today is a way we can go forward together. Sovereign United Kingdom, making its own decisions, but a strong and successful European Union working too. Thank you.
Very good afternoon to you. You're watching Sky News. It's just after 3:15, where the Prime Minister has just laid out her vision for Britain's future relationship with the European Union. Lots to chew over there. Let's talk to our Europe correspondent Mark Stone, who's been monitoring events in Florence. Mark, key points for you?
Two major headlines, I think, both of which had been somewhat leaked out. The first is that she is out now officially advocating a transition period or an implementation period. As she puts it, she thinks it would be in both sides' interests. She thinks it would probably last about 2 years. It would have a double lock on it in that it is time limited. So there is no chance of it running and us, the UK, ending up not leaving the European Union. And key within that implementation period, as she calls it, she says that access to both sides' markets, in other words, the single market, should continue on current terms. What she's effectively saying is that the status quo would remain beyond March 2019 for around about 2 years, with one key exception. Because the UK will not officially be a member of the European Union, it will not have a seat at the table. It's kind of like the Norway model for that 2-year period. That is the first key headline, I would say. The other is what appears to be, and I'm still trying to get a bit of clarification on quite what she meant, and semantics are incredibly important within the body of this speech. She talked about the financial contribution, financial commitment that Britain needs to make, the so-called exit bill, and she suggested, or she said quite clearly, that there was another uncertainty for the 27. So clearly there is uncertainty for businesses and citizens right across the continent, but she said there was a specific uncertainty for the 27, and that is a hole in their budget. We've heard about it many times before. The EU is a large contributor to, the UK is a large contributor to the EU. When we leave, it will leave a hole in their budget, and she made it quite clear that they would not have that hole. In other words, the UK would fill that hole, would continue to pay money in to make sure that that hole is filled. What is not entirely clear, from my point of view at least, is whether or not she's also advocating spending or paying things on top of the budget itself, the so-called RAL, which is effectively the EU's credit card, stuff that we have already committed to spending. but whether or not she will actually pay for that as part of a so-called divorce bill, I'm not entirely clear. We'll probably get a little bit more on that as more trickles out in background briefings that will be happening now. She talked too about the two extremes in terms of the two possible bespoke or off-the-shelf deals that we could have as a future relationship. The first being a Norway model, whereby we are effectively a member of the EU, except we're not actually a member, so we don't have a seat at the table. That is one model. She said that was simply no good because we would lose sovereignty in doing that. The other is a Canada-style trade agreement. She said neither of those two extremes really fit the bill. We need to be imaginative. Both sides need to be imaginative. But for me, what she didn't spell out is what that imagination could lead to, what sort of a relationship Britain could have outside the EU. So I think there will be plenty of questions that the EU side and indeed both sides of this broader Brexit argument will still have as a result of this speech.
OK, Mark, for now, many thanks indeed. Get the views of the former UKIP leader Nigel Farage. Mr Farage, really good to see you this afternoon. So was this 5,000 words of platitudes, or was there more substance for you?
Very little substance at all, other than what she's made clear is that her vision, leave the European Union, but we do so in name only. We stay part of all the current structures, and what we do is we simply rebadge the status quo, whether it's in science or security or whatever area you care to mention. She thinks those relationships have been beneficial. And I thought the most telling line of the whole speech was towards the end when she said, "We don't seek an unfair competitive advantage." Well, that's what I voted for. I voted for us to be able to be competitive, to be global, to be free of European laws, and she shows no desire or no vision to be the kind of leader we need to take us on to be a global trading nation.
Mr Farage, Theresa May and her supporters will say that the negotiations so far have come to a stalemate. They have stalled. We're only a few days away from the next round of negotiations. So in this case, in this circumstance, perhaps it's best to give this round to Europe so we can in order for us to be able to move to the next stage of the negotiation process.
Anyone that's worked in business knows that when you enter a negotiation, both sides have to be prepared to walk away from the table and for there to be no deal. That previously was her position. She dropped that today. So today she said, look, whatever happens, we won't walk away from the table, but will you please, in the course of the next few years, and I say few years because with a transition period, this is all going to go on until 2021, would you please give us the kind of arrangements that we ask for? I wouldn't be surprised if her vision of a 2-year transition didn't become many, many times more than that.
Transport Secretary Chris Grayling has said that this speech outlines Theresa May's bold vision for our relationship with the European Union.
Well, it outlines a vision for our relationship with the European Union being virtually unaltered, but just under a different series of badges and titles.
So where do we go from here, Mr Farage? As I said, we're only a few days from the next round of negotiations. Michel Barnier yesterday said that he was confused, he was dumbstruck that we are still talking about issues from weeks ago. Is this not the right approach? And what would your approach be? What would your recommendations to Theresa May be right now?
I don't think Mr Barnier wants a deal. I think right from the start he's made a series of totally impossible demands. We do keep giving. We get nothing back in return. The idea that because we pay a membership fee for 2 further years, that'll satisfy Mr Barnier financially, I think, frankly, is for the birds. The only hope, I think, that the Brits have got is to go above the people living and working in Brussels, to go straight to the member state governments, to go straight to the manufacturers who make cars and wine and sell it in this country and try and get some pressure put on there for a sensible trade deal. And if that route doesn't work, then rather than waste years of our lives, rather than sending out a signal to the rest of the world that we won't be open for business until at least 2022, it would be better, if we're not going to get a decent deal, to walk away from it and start again.
Theresa May spoke of rejection of the Canada and Norway model. What model would you propose? What would be the best way forwards for the United Kingdom now?
Well, logic says that as one of the most important export markets in the world, that a free trade deal is in all of our interests. Barnier, Juncker and Verhofstadt don't want that, but it's pretty clear that the electorates of the other European countries would want that. So we have to try and form some compact with the countries in Europe, not this central group in Brussels who are acting in their own interests. I would think that's the only hope we have of reaching a deal.
Nigel Farage, many thanks indeed. Well, let's get some thoughts and opinions on this subject. So with Labour's Ben Bradshaw and the Conservative MP James Cleverly. Many thanks indeed to you both, gentlemen, for joining us this afternoon. James Cleverly, if I could firstly start with you. The Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, has tweeted that this speech was positive, optimistic and dynamic. Was he right?
I think the tone of this speech was exactly what was needed at this point in time. It made it clear that we still value our relationship with the EU, that our relationship will continue even once we leave the formal structure of the EU. And it did set out a positive, dynamic vision for both the UK and the remaining nations of the EU. I think the tone was spot on and is exactly what was needed at this point in time.
Ben Bradshaw, that the tone is absolutely spot on. It's exactly what the United Kingdom needed for this moment in time?
Well, unless I'm missing something, Gamal, the Prime Minister seems to have adopted Labour's current policy on Brexit today, which of course I welcome, a transition period with exactly the same rules and systems as we have already, which is exactly what Labour's been arguing for. But we're still not clear about what the end game of the government is. But I welcome the recognition after 15 wasted months that, yes, there will be a large bill to pay, there'll be a significant transition period. And I also welcome the ending of this loose talk about no deal, the Prime Minister accepting that would be a disaster both for us and for the rest of Europe.
James Cleverly, so the Prime Minister's adopted Labour's position.
Look, even a stopped clock is right twice a day. And Labour have covered all the bases over the last 15 months in the customs union, outside the customs union, free movement, no free movement. So if you chuck enough darts at the dartboard, one of them is going to hit the bullseye. The Prime Minister has set forward a very sensible, pragmatic set of proposals. She's made it very clear it's in our mutual interest to get a deal. But the implicit, and Ben I think is wrong on this, the implicit message is that if we don't come to a deal, a sensible deal, history will look badly on both of us. And it's in the EU's gift, just as much as it is in ours, to make sure we get that deal sorted.
Ben Bradshaw?
Yes, no, I agree with that. But of course, a no-deal scenario would be far more damaging to the UK than it will to the rest of the European Union. But I think the basic problem remains here, Gamal, that we had before this speech and we saw with Boris Johnson's intervention last week, is that the Cabinet is deeply divided as to what the end game should be, with some in the Cabinet, like Boris Johnson, wanting some free market nirvana with low regulation and low taxes, which would be dreadful for Britain, particularly for working people, and more moderate Conservatives, the Chancellor and Amber Rudd and others, wanting us to have as close a relationship with our biggest single market on our doorstep as we possibly can. And until that issue is resolved, I don't see a deal that even the Cabinet are going to be able to agree on, let alone the British people.
James Cleverly, there seems to be a lot riding on this, and it's fair to say that the Prime Minister, she had a lot of audience here. You had the British public, you had her own cabinet, you had the European Parliament, her counterparts over in Europe. Do you think this speech did enough to allay the fears and concerns of all those different groups of people? Nigel Farage, speaking earlier on this show, doesn't seem to think so.
Well, as you can imagine, I don't spend my life hanging on Nigel Farage's every word, so you'll excuse me if I don't concern myself too much about his views on what's happened here. However, the people that do matter, the people that we are negotiating on behalf of, the British people, British businesses, EU nationals currently living here in the UK, these people want and deserve a degree of certainty. And this speech sets out what the future could look like if we come to a sensible conclusion with the EU, and I hope and I expect that we will do. And it will give them the opportunity to start planning, and that's particularly important for businesses. We heard the people
James Cleverly, are we the wiser for this? Sorry, James, if I could just add, I mean, are we any wiser on this? Because the Prime Minister, she ruled out a Norway model, she ruled out a Canada model, so we don't exactly know what model we're going to be moving forward. She said that she wants the United Kingdom to have a bespoke deal, but we're still none the wiser.
No, I disagree fundamentally. We have heard from the Lancaster House speech a consistent thread that because of our unique starting point in these negotiations, it is entirely sensible that we have a bespoke arrangement with the EU going forward. She's also made it clear explicitly for the first time that we are hoping to get a 2-year implementation period and that we are willing to continue our contributions through that period of time. That gives British businesses certainty, gives the EU a degree of certainty, and it strikes me as a very sensible, pragmatic offer and request.
Ben Bradshaw, on the issue of the 2-year implementation period and, paying out what we owe to the European Union, honouring our commitments. I mean, the Prime Minister didn't exactly give a specific figure, but I guess the real concern is that the Europeans will say was that they're just paying their commitments anyway. So effectively, when the United Kingdom leaves the European Union, Europe will be getting nothing.
Well, except the Prime Minister did indicate quite strongly that she felt that we would contribute after we left, if we leave, to take part, for example, in scientific and security and other collaborative work with the EU, so that's not really clear. But look, I welcome the fact that after 15 long and wasted months, we do have some clarity, at least about the transitional deal, which will be reassuring to business, to trade unions, and to EU citizens here and British citizens living on the continent. But we're still none the wiser about what the end game is. And until we know that, I'm afraid it's very difficult for the European Union. Don't forget, this is 27 countries negotiating with us, one. It's very difficult for them, if they don't know what we want, to have a proper negotiation with us. And that big question, as the end game, is still unresolved.
James Cleverly, is this the Brexit that Brexiteers envisioned?
Well, throughout that speech, the Prime Minister made it very, very clear that we were leaving the EU because that's what the British people had voted for, that our relationship with the EU had always been a little bit uncomfortable because of our unique set of circumstances. But she made it very clear in a number of occasions and a number of points through that speech, we are going to leave the European Union. That is unambiguous. That is not up for negotiation. It's going to happen. And I think that's what people voted for in June 2016. That's what they expect. That's what they deserve. That's what they're going to get.
Ben Bradshaw, James Cleverly, gentlemen, many thanks indeed for joining us this afternoon and sharing your thoughts on the Prime Minister's speech today. So let's drill down now into the details of the Prime Minister's speech. Our economics editor, Ed Conway, is standing by. Ed.
Yeah, thanks, Kamal. And it really was a more optimistic speech that we heard from Theresa May today than perhaps some of her previous speeches. And here you can see bits of it. We're going to go through some kind of textual analysis. And this was one phrase that she used relatively early on. We can do so much better than this. And there was also this talk about optimism, ambition. She actually used this word creative or creativity about 10 times in the speech. So it was talking in a kind of creative sense, talking in an optimistic sense. But what was actually new beyond the tone? Well, let's have a look at this. This is the implementation period. Of course, there's been a lot of focus on this big question. Once the UK leaves at the end of the Article 50 period, what happens then? Is there a cliff edge? Or do things get kind of maintained as they are for quite some time until Britain's actually sorted out its future relationship? Well, for the first time, we got an explicit answer from Theresa May. As of today, these considerations point towards an implementation period of 2 years. And that's really the first time that she's been quite so explicit about that. What does an implementation period actually mean? Well, have a look at this. Just before that, she talked about this. Businesses and public services should only have to plan for one set of changes in the relationship between the UK and the EU. So, during the period, access to one another's markets should continue on current terms. So the big question is, does that actually mean that the UK effectively stays within the EU, stays within the equivalent of the EEA, the single market, and stays within the customs union? Some people have ruled that out previously. Liam Fox and Philip Hammond in an op-ed previously suggested that wouldn't be the case. Perhaps it will, the implication of this says. Then there's that question about the bill. So what happens? How much does the UK end up having to pay the EU after it leaves? And here there was also a little bit more detail. She said that some of the claims are exaggerated on this, unhelpful, but this is the key thing. Let me highlight it for you here. The UK will honour commitments we have made during the period of our membership. What does that mean? Well, it means certainly the implication is the UK would continue to pay the equivalent of what it was paying into the EU budget for a couple of years after it left. That means maybe 20 billion euros. It might even mean more than that because there are certain extra commitments, something called the Reste Liquide Fund, which the UK might well have to contribute to in the future as well. So a clear acknowledgement there will be money paid beyond even what the UK has to pay once it ceases to become a member. Another interesting thing here was security. Now, you'll probably remember from the Lancaster House speech and indeed from the Article 50 letter, a lot of talk about security. And this time around, it was a key word as well that came up many times indeed. And this is rather interesting here. Towards the bottom of this page, a treaty between the UK and the EU. So a security treaty, bilateral between the UK and the EU in the future. That's another new thing here. Theresa May obviously very hot on the security issue. Whether that's something that will tempt the people within the EU, the negotiators, we will have to see. But that's part of the new news today.
Ed, good to see you. Let's go back to Florence and talk to our political editor, Faisal Islam. So, Faisal, we were expecting the announcement of this two-year transitional arrangement, and that's what we got.
Yes, we did. I think you have to take a step back a minute. And I think what Theresa May was trying to do here was create a well of goodwill that, frankly, has been missing in this exercise to date in order to create some incentives between the European Union and the UK, and those meetings between Monsieur Barnier and Mr Davis, but also in the EU 28 Council and 27 Council, try and create an incentive to come up with something very creative. Because at the moment, the relationship that she has outlined long-term does not exist anywhere, and it will take goodwill. That's why we got the speech. That's why she's here in Florence, praising European culture, saying we praise the European Union. We want it to be stronger. We want it to go on and thrive on the journey in which it's embarked on closer integration, as outlined by Jean-Claude Juncker last week. So that was the diplomatic game. But the specifics were really quite interesting. The transition period, I think, is the newest thing that has been confirmed today. It's been hinted at. We saw bits and bobs in the position papers. This is not the flavour of transition period you would have taken from her Lancaster House speech, but nor did her Lancaster House speech actually rule this out. 2 years, and I give you two quotes. The framework would be the existing structure of EU rules and regulations. That seems to mean European Court of Justice, some form of freedom of movement exchange continuing, and also other rules applying, which some will argue, and it seems like Nigel Farage does see it in this way, is basically an extension of the economic part of EU membership, even as someone like Theresa May won't be going to the European Council. We won't have MEPs and we won't have a commissioner. And you said 2 years, but here's the actual quote from the Prime Minister's speech. She said that it would be around 2 years as of today. So there's some wriggle room there. Now, the PM's people say, well, it could be less than that for certain industries, but I'm sure that there are others who are dying to see a betrayal narrative who could argue that that might end up being longer. But the bigger point here is a bridge, a transition. It needs to be a bridge to somewhere. She recognised that in the speech. What is the long-term relationship that she thinks that we're heading towards? The EU wants to know too, and that's where she said things get creative, that neither will we have the straightforward free trade agreement that is Canada's style, nor the integrated membership of the European Economic Area, the so-called Norway model. For my money, it sounded like she was warmer to, you know, if there's a spectrum here, she was maybe 60%, 65% towards Norway rather than Canada. I put that very point to the Prime Minister. This is how she replied.
This is one of the things I would say to you, Faisal, is that I suggest that you start thinking not just about Norway and Canada, but actually about the fact that the UK is in a completely different relationship with the EU from either of those countries when they started negotiating their relationship with the EU. And that gives us an opportunity to create a partnership that is completely different from either of those. What we're talking about during the implementation period is a period of time for the practical changes that are necessary to put in place the full new partnership. And of course, you can't do those practical changes until you know what the partnership is. And the negotiations, of course, we will leave at the end of March 2019, and negotiations will be continuing potentially up quite close to that time. But let's think creatively. Let's be ambitious about what we can achieve, because, as I said, we start from an unprecedented position in terms of our current relationship with the EU. We remember we're coming out, but that enables us to build a different sort of partnership for the future.
Now, Gamal, the reason why I thought that she sounded a little more on the spectrum towards a kind of EA-ish solution or near Norway solution was she said this of the Canada model. She said, we can do so much better than this. It's just straightforward trading arrangement. That's what people like Nigel Farage want. That's what some of her Brexiteer backbenchers think. I also think there's a political calculation here that the leavers on her backbenchers, who might be tempted to think, is this really the Brexit we wanted to go for? Well, they also will have seen the election results, and they'll have seen that they would rather have a Brexit than no Brexit, or even a Labour Brexit. So there's multiple calculations, multiple bits of diplomacy the PM's having to pull off, and I think she will be waiting with bated breath as to how this goes down with the European Union. I think there's a basis here for her to win the sufficient progress, if not in October, perhaps by December.
Faisal, it is a real headache for now. Many thanks indeed. Well, speaking of Labour, the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, has just been speaking. This is what he had to say.
Well, 15 months on since the referendum, and we get to a situation where the Prime Minister faces the reality that she's going to have to look for a transition period. She's had 15 months to think about that, and she goes all the way to Florence, and we didn't even get a chance to see Florence in the background to tell us what we already know. And indeed, it was part of our amendment to the EU withdrawal bill to look for a transition period. It's got to happen.
And what she said about that transition period is that effectively it could mean up to 5 years after the vote, not much has changed. Is that the right approach to a transition?
Well, there has to be a transition period to protect jobs. Our whole point throughout this whole process has been a Brexit that damages employment and jobs is very, very dangerous for everybody in this country. And so that is our basic approach to this.
Mrs May also signalled that she would honour the UK's financial commitments, which could mean some payments possibly post-transition. How much do you think is the right amount to pay the EU?
I don't think it's possible to put a figure on it. Clearly, there are obligations that must be met, and clearly the EU have obligations to make to this country. But this whole speech seemed to me the product of the internal negotiations of the Tory party rather than negotiations with the EU. She, after all, seemed to slap down both Boris and David Davis during the speech.
She did say that they would stick to the principles in the Lancaster House speech, which would mean after the transition, leaving the single market and the customs union. Do you think that's the right thing, or do you think there should be some acceptance of free movement to maintain good access to the single market and the customs union?
There has to be a trade relationship with Europe in the future. Half of all our trade is with the EU. Our manufacturing industry works very closely with the EU supply chains to both sides of the channel. That's got to be maintained. There are a large number of EU nationals that live and work in this country and make an incredible contribution to it. Without them, all our public services would be much worse off. So, why is she using them as a bargaining chip? Why not do what we did a week after the referendum, which was to say, legislate now to guarantee rights of residence for EU nationals in Britain so they can continue. Because there's stress and tension of families where one partner is from Europe, the other partner from Britain, and they have children here. They need to know they've got security in the future. They haven't got it. She's still using them as a shuttlecock in her negotiations.
So how will our European counterparts view Theresa May's speech? We can get the reaction from our Europe correspondent, Mark Stone. So, Mark, talk of new treaties, bespoke deals. How are the Europeans going to take this?
Well, we're still waiting for Michel Barnier, the EU's chief spokesman, chief negotiator, I should say, to give his views on it. We've heard a lot from politicians over the course of the past hour or so. Let's hear from an academic, someone who is close to watching the negotiations closely, Professor Brigitte Laffan from the European University here in Florence. Thanks for talking to us. What do you make of what you heard?
Well, I think it was an important speech in that it showed that the British Cabinet now has a minimal agreement on the next couple of years. But beyond that, the future relationship is extraordinarily vague and characterised by language like bold, imaginative, creative, versatile. That's not content. And the EU works on process, procedure and content and substance.
Number 10 are helpfully sort of briefing out bullet points of what they think Theresa May was trying to say. So I'll put some of them to you. On EU citizens, they say further reassurance to EU citizens living in the UK. Your thoughts?
Yes, there was, in that she did accept that European law might inform British jurisprudence. But I think that the EU 27 will look for stronger assurances, because I think the behaviour of the Home Office in the last year has been such that there's a real failure and a lack of trust with the Home Office.
On money, they say EU countries will not need to pay more or receive less over the remainder of the current EU budget. In other words, you don't need to worry, we're going to plug your hole.
I think that's important, but I think that's the minimum. So the question is, what's the figure and what's the number? And that's where the negotiations will have to go.
Because essentially what they appear to be saying is, we want an implementation period, a transition period, and we're going to pay for that. And the EU will say, well, yes, you are.
But you'll also pay for all of the existing and pre-existing obligations.
OK, so on the implementation period specifically, they say that they want a strictly time-limited implementation period based on current terms. In other words, we stay in the single market. It is the EU in all but name. Is it kind of like the Norway model for that implementation period?
No, in fact, it's much more in a way, because everything will apply during that very short period. But of course, the UK won't have a seat at the table. So in that sense, it's like the Norwegian model.
How well do you think this will go down on the EU side? We're awaiting Michel Barnier's response.
I think that the EU always expected the necessity of a transition period. I think most of it will, in a sense, be expected. The real problem is that the British Cabinet has not yet begun to tackle the future relationship. And there's no way that they can have the kind of future relationship that maintains the existing rights without obligation. So for the UK, the question is, what is it going to lose? And the EU isn't going to make a special deal across every possible sector for the UK.
She was quite clear on that, is that she didn't want a Canada model. She didn't want a Norway model. She didn't want to pick something off the shelf. She wanted something bespoke. How's that going to go down?
Not well, because that bespoke will be translated into cake and eat it, and cake and eat it is not an option, nor is cherry picking. So I would say that the UK faces an enormous challenge still in terms of firstly identifying where they want to go with the future partnership, but then also what EU 27 will be willing to agree to. So I can imagine a deal that is more than Canada, but not dramatically more, if the UK doesn't want the jurisprudence of the ECJ, for example.
And in one word, will sufficient progress have been made by the end of this coming negotiating week?
No, and nor by October.
OK. All right. Brigitte Laffan, Professor at the European University here in Florence. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Mark, many thanks indeed. We've been getting a reaction from people up and down the country. Lisa Holland has been up in Sunderland talking to people there.
Sunderland, of course, sees itself as having had that iconic moment when it was first to declare support for the Leave vote. It was overwhelming, and it sent, of course, that seismic message to the rest of the country about which way the wind was blowing. Now, a couple of people who voted to support Leave at that time are Diane and Phil, who I have with me now. So we now know that Theresa May is proposing a transition period. Some people could read that as a sort of slight postponement of Brexit. How do you feel about that?
I think Theresa May hasn't got a plan. I think Theresa May doesn't know what she's doing, and so she's taken an extra 2 years to make her mind up, to go away and think about it. She should have had a plan in action by now. We voted last year to leave the EU. She knew then that that was what was going to happen, and why put it off? She's going to pay for 4 years. We're going to have to pay into the EU. That money needs spending in this country now. That money should have been spent in this country last year. That money should have been spent in this country from 1973. I don't think we and any of the people in the North East and across the UK realise how much money is being wasted. We need that money spending in this country now.
But of course, people would argue that Britain is committed to giving that money, and you can't just walk away from a deal. It's like walking away to any obligation. They've already said that they will pay that kind of money. Don't you agree that there has to be a sort of comfortable period in leaving so that things have got right, or does it really frustrate you that it's going to be another 4 years?
We kind of knew that it was going to take a couple of years. We expected that, but to add another 2 years onto that is just a kick in the teeth, really, for the people that have voted to leave.
And Phil, you're a local author here. You wrote a book on the future of Sunderland. What sort of future do you think Sunderland has? Because, of course, so many people have been saying to me here, tens of thousands of jobs have been lost over recent decades in those traditional industries. And people feel frustrated with the EU, even if the EU isn't necessarily to blame. What do you think the future holds now with a slower exit from the EU?
Well, I think it'll help, to be honest. I mean, as Diane rightly said, there was no plan in action. You know, I mean, throughout the whole campaign, it was abysmal. No one had a clue, really, what was going to happen if we left. You know, it was never really sort of spelled out of what would happen. But to be honest with you, I haven't got a problem with it, simply because it will give everyone time to settle down, sort it out, sort the trade deal out. I mean, it's all been bluster since it happened. It's all been bluster. There's been no real discussion of note as far as what we've been told. Obviously, behind closed doors, there might be a lot more. But for me personally, as long as they're getting it right and the trade deal gets sorted, then for me, it's not that much of an issue, as long as it goes ahead as well. You know, and that's ultimately we do have to leave, because that's how
you both, of course, voted to leave. Phil, Diane, thank you both very much indeed. So as you can see, mixed response there from some people who perhaps up and down the country may feel that this deal is too slow now, but others who say, well, look, it takes time to get the best deal possible for Britain.
Lisa Holland reporting there from Sunderland.